The door wasn't shut all the way. I don't know why I noticed it. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just one of those moments where the universe tilts, giving you a glimpse into something you weren't meant to see. Either way, I stopped in my tracks, staring at the sliver of space between the door and the frame. Inside, my mother's voice was low, hushed, but sharp enough to cut through the silence of the house. "You can't keep pretending, Michael." My breath caught. My fingers curled against my palm. She wasn't alone. A deeper voice murmured something in response. The words didn't reach me, but the tone did. Tension. Thick enough to taste. I stepped closer, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. My mother's shadow moved across the dim light spilling from inside. The way she stood, the way her shoulders angled, something wasn't right. I should have left. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I pressed forward just enough to see through the gap. And what I saw, I wasn't ready for it. The room was dimly lit, the glow of a bedside lamp casting long shadows against the walls. The air inside felt different, heavier, like something unspoken had been hanging between them long before I arrived. Mom stood near the bed, her back partially turned, her posture tense. Across from her, Michael shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked cornered. "You don't have to lie to me," Mom said, softer this time. Michael exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "This isn't," he stopped. Shook his head. "I don't know what you want me to say." Mom took a step closer. "Not much. Just enough." I saw the way Michael swallowed, the way his Adam's apple bobbed, the way his shoulders tightened as if bracing for something he couldn't name. I should have turned away. I should have backed off, shut the door, and pretended I hadn't seen any of it. But my feet stayed planted. My breath stayed trapped in my lungs. And my mother's voice came again, soft, knowing, dangerous. "I think you do." The silence stretched. I should have backed away from the door, should have unheard whatever was happening inside that room. But my body wasn't listening. My fingers curled against the frame, knuckles white, heart hammering. Inside, my mother's voice dipped lower, controlled but edged with something sharp. Something I had never heard from her before. "You need to be honest with me." Michael shifted again. I could barely see him from my angle, but I could hear his breath, unsteady, shallow. He was nervous. "Why?" My mother took a step forward. The light hit her differently now, highlighting the sharp angles of her face, the intensity in her gaze. Not angry. Not sad. Calculated. Michael swallowed. "I don't think you believe me. Try me." Something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. Like she already knew. Like this was some kind of test and he was about to fail. I sucked in a breath, shifting my weight, trying not to make a sound. Michael finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "It's not safe." My mother smiled. But it wasn't warmth. It was victory. "Oh, Michael," she murmured, tilting her head. "Nothing ever is." And then the lights went out. I could feel the air in the room shift as the tension grew unbearable. The lights flickered back on after a long moment of darkness, but nothing felt the same anymore. We were too close now. My body was still pressed against the doorframe, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of what I had just overheard. Inside, Michael and my mother stood at the center of the room, frozen, their gazes locked. His eyes were wide, almost frantic. She, on the other hand, was eerily calm, her expression unreadable, as if nothing had shifted between them. But I could feel it, the pressure between them, thick as smoke, suffocating the space. "Mom," I finally found my voice, raw and trembling. Her head snapped toward me. There was a brief flicker of surprise, but it was quickly masked by a forced smile. Too controlled. Too practiced. "You're still here?" she asked softly, like nothing was wrong. I swallowed, barely holding it together. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I don't understand. What's going on between you two?" Michael looked away, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. He couldn't meet my eyes. My mother stepped forward slowly, closing the gap between us. The room suddenly felt too small, as if it was closing in on me. "You don't need to understand, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice a dangerous mix of sweetness and authority. "This is between Michael and me." The words hit me like a punch. The weight of them was suffocating. My mind couldn't process them fast enough. The air felt thick with unspoken truths, and I could feel my pulse racing in my ears. "No," I gasped. "This is wrong." Is it? She asked, almost amused. Her proximity to me made it worse. I could feel the warmth of her body, the power in her presence, and suddenly I wasn't sure if I was standing in front of my mother anymore. Her fingers brushed against my arm as she moved past me, and it was almost too much. Too much warmth. Too much pressure. Too much everything. She paused, her gaze falling on Michael. The air shifted again. Michael took a step forward, but before he could say anything, she placed a hand on his chest, stopping him. My heart was racing. Was this real? Was this happening? You've been so careful, Michael, she said, her voice now low and hushed. Too careful. You're afraid of what you want. I flinched at her words as if they were meant for me. I felt something like a knot twist in my stomach. The room was spinning now and I couldn't breathe. My mother turned back toward me, her eyes now sharp with something I hadn't seen before. Not love. Not concern. Something colder. Calculating. Do you know what it's like being stuck in a life of pretend? She asked, her voice low but steady. Trying to convince yourself that everything's perfect, when really it's all just a facade? I wanted to scream, to run, but I stood frozen. You don't understand because you haven't been there. Her voice rose just slightly, but enough to make my heart race. There was something dark in her tone, and then in the blink of an eye everything changed. Before I could process the shift, she was inches away from me, her hand gripping my chin, forcing my eyes to meet hers. Her gaze burned through me. You don't get to judge me, not yet. Not until you know what it's like to really feel something. Her words cut deeper than anything I could have imagined. I tried to pull away, but her grip was firm. Her eyes were so cold, so intense, like she was testing me, pushing me to break. And then for a split second I saw it. The vulnerability behind her eyes, the fear she was masking so well. This wasn't just a game for her. This was something real. My heart pounded. Was I supposed to forgive her? Was I supposed to believe that this was some kind of twisted lesson? Mom, please, my voice was barely a whisper. Her grip tightened just a fraction. You'll learn one way or another. What's real? What's worth holding on to? I couldn't breathe. The weight of it all was too much. Suddenly, I was aware of everything. The heat in the room, the rush of blood in my ears, the unsettling closeness between us. I could feel the pull between us. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if it was anger, fear, or something else entirely. The silence in the room was suffocating. Each breath felt too loud, too heavy, as if the very air was charged with the weight of everything we hadn't said. The tension hung between us like a thick fog, making it impossible to think clearly. I watched my mother from across the room, the same woman who had raised me, who had been my rock for years. But tonight she was a stranger. You don't understand, she said, her voice trembling with something I couldn't place. This isn't what you think. I could feel my heart pounding. The words I had been holding back finally clawing their way to the surface. My hands were shaking, my palms slick with sweat. Then explain it to me. Why do I feel like everything I knew about you was a lie? She flinched at my words, the intensity in her eyes faltering for just a moment. I took a step forward, the space between us shrinking, though the distance felt insurmountable. The air crackled with raw emotion, with all the things we had both been too afraid to confront. I'm not the person you think I am, she whispered, her voice breaking as if confessing a truth too painful to bear. A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to shout at her, to demand answers, but the words felt like stones in my mouth. I had known for a while now that there was something off, something beneath the surface, but hearing her say it aloud felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. You've kept me in the dark, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, but it carried all the weight of betrayal. All these years you've kept me in the dark. The words hung in the air, but instead of feeling triumphant, I felt empty, as if all my anger had been drained from me. My mother looked at me, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the woman I had always known, but it was quickly replaced with something darker, something I couldn't quite place. I didn't want you to know, she said softly, almost apologetically. I didn't want you to see me for who I really am. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. What was she saying? I'm your mother, she added, almost as if reminding herself, her hands shaking as she tried to reach for me. But I'm also more than that. I took a step back, the overwhelming need to understand battling with the fear of what it might mean. What does that even mean? Her eyes softened for a second, but there was something behind them. A sharpness, a pain, a deep sorrow I couldn't quite understand. I've done things I'm not proud of. The room felt smaller, tighter. Every word she spoke seemed to make the walls close in around me. The truth was unraveling, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. I took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength I had left. What things? My voice cracked as I said it, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know. I needed to understand. Her gaze dropped to the floor, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her secrets was too much to bear. I've made choices, things I can't undo, and I'm afraid. Afraid you'll hate me when you find out. The confession hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stand there, frozen, waiting for her to explain. Tell me, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Tell me what you're hiding. For a long moment there was nothing but silence between us. I watched as she struggled with herself, as if the truth was a force she couldn't escape. And then finally she spoke. I've been with someone else, she said, her voice trembling as she looked up at me. Someone who isn't your father. Someone I never should have been with. I felt the ground shift beneath me. The words didn't make sense at first. My mind was scrambling, trying to make sense of the confession. My mother had been with someone else? Someone who wasn't my father? I didn't want you to know, she said again, her voice now thick with emotion. I didn't want you to look at me and see someone different. Someone flawed. Flawed? She wasn't flawed, she was my mother. She was supposed to be the one who had all the answers, the one who kept the world from falling apart. But now everything was shattering. The tension that had been building between us snapped, the fragile wall between us crumbling. I was angry. I was hurt. But more than anything, I was confused. How could she do this? How could she betray my father? Betray the family we had built together? I don't know who you are anymore, I said, my voice thick with tears I didn't want to shed. I don't know who you've become. She reached out, her hand shaking, but I pulled away. Don't touch me, I spat, the anger flaring up like a fire I couldn't control. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I never wanted to hurt you. You did, I said, my chest tight with the weight of everything I couldn't say. You've hurt me more than you'll ever know. I turned to leave, but something held me back. A part of me wanted to flee, to get away from the woman who had just shattered everything I knew. But another part of me, the part one wasn't ready to face, wanted to stay and try to understand, try to fix what was broken. But there was no fixing this. There was only acceptance of the fact that everything had changed. And I wasn't ready to accept it. As I walked out of the room, the sound of her soft sobs echoed behind me. And I realized with a painful clarity that we were both lost now. The bond we once had was broken, and there was no going back. The house was quiet now, but the silence felt different, heavy, pregnant with everything that had been said and unsaid. The storm had passed, but the wreckage was everywhere. I stood in the hallway, staring at the door to my mother's room. Everything had changed. My fingers brushed against the doorframe, the cold wood grounding me, but I didn't move. She was in there, probably still crying, still processing. But I didn't know what I was supposed to do now. Should I walk in? Should I say something? Or was this it? Was this the point where we both simply stepped away from each other and let the distance grow too large to ever close again? I couldn't shake the image of her face, her vulnerability mixed with the guilt, the pain, the shame. Was that how she saw herself now? Was that what she was carrying, or was it something more? The walls felt too tight around me, every breath I took labored. I wanted to break free of the weight that had settled in my chest, but nothing was simple anymore. Nothing would ever be the same. I took a deep breath, the air thick in my lungs, and finally pushed the door open. Her face was pale, eyes red from crying, but she didn't look surprised to see me. She'd been waiting for this moment, hadn't she? You're still here, she whispered, her voice raw. I nodded, standing by the doorway. I didn't know what to say, or if I even had the right to say anything. The room was filled with unspoken words, thick with the weight of everything that had passed between us. Every glance, every touch, every interaction that had once felt like security now felt like a trap. A lie we both had been living. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words barely audible. For everything. I swallowed, forcing the lump in my throat down. The words felt like they didn't belong. They didn't fix anything, didn't erase what had been said or done. Could they? I don't know if I can forgive you, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I don't even know if I want to. She nodded, her gaze falling to her hands. The apology wasn't enough, I knew that. Nothing could undo the past few hours, let alone the years of secrecy. I couldn't just forgive her because she was sorry. I know, she said, her voice breaking. And I don't expect you to. The words hung in the air between us like a weight neither of us could lift. I could feel the tension in the room, the pull between us, but it wasn't the same as before. There was no safety in this closeness, no comfort. Only raw truth, sharp edges, and nothing to hold on to. I took a step back, breaking the stillness between us. The quiet was suffocating now, and I could feel the stirrings of something inside of me. An instinct to leave, to run. This wasn't home anymore. I don't know what happens now, I said softly, more to myself than to her. She didn't answer right away. She simply watched me as if she was trying to read the new version of me, the one that was different from the child she had raised, the one that had just learned too much. There were things between us now, things that could never be unseen, never be forgotten. I turned to leave, but then she called my name softly. Wait, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I hesitated but didn't turn back. I couldn't look at her, not right now. I still love you, she said, the words cracked and fragile. And for a moment I felt the sting of them deep and raw. Did I still love her? Or had that love been something I had created, a version of her that no longer existed? Had it ever been real? I know, I whispered, my heart heavy with things I didn't know how to say. And then without another word I walked out. The house felt different as I stepped out into the yard, the cool night air biting at my skin. I could still feel the weight of everything, the conversations, the confessions, and the things left unsaid. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it over? Or was it just the beginning of something even more dangerous? Something we couldn't yet comprehend? I didn't know. I didn't have answers. And that, in itself, was terrifying. As I walked away from the house, my heart ached with uncertainty. There were no clear answers, no neat resolution. The future was a blur, full of questions. Would we ever be able to come back from this? Or was this the point of no return? I didn't know. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same.